On page 34, you talked about how God, he travels with clouds of hail and fire. Can you talk about the significance of that?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, and it ties into this talk of divine emissaries. So, in Psalm 18, Yahweh is said to travel with, I think it's clouds of hail and embers of fire, something like that. And then a few verses earlier, he's described riding on the cherubs. And there are other passages too where cherubs are either compared to or identified with clouds. So, in this particular passage in Psalm 18, I interpreted the clouds of hail and fire as being two clouds. So one cloud that can send hail and one cloud that can send fire or lightning. And this it ties into a topic that I've written about before. I'd given a conference presentation a couple of years ago about how Yahweh has two divine companions and how that fits his nature as a sun god. So I'll go through that a little bit, but also talk about the hail and fire specifically. So the seventh plague in Egypt, it involves Yahweh sending hail and fire, and the Hebrew words for these things are barad for hail and ish for fire. And so we tend to think of these as just natural elements, but in the ancient Near East, I mean, almost everything was seen as some sort of divine entity, with various ranks of the deity, but there was no such thing really as a strictly like meteorological phenomenon. So this is, I think, confirmed by another account of the same plague. So the seventh plague is talked about in Psalm 78, and in that case, instead of it being Barad and Aish, it says Yahweh sent Barad and Resheph. And so this word Resheph, it's usually translated fire, but the actual etymology of the word is, kind of uncertain. But what we do know about Resheph is that he was a fairly significant god in the ancient Near East, and he was basically the West Semitic version of Nergal, who was a god of the underworld in Mesopotamia. And in Ugaritic texts, we find Resheph a few times, and he seems to have this role in one text of opening the gate of the underworld for Shapshu, which is the sun goddess. So that was really intriguing, especially when I found that in Egypt there are these triad stelas where the sun goddess appears in the center and she has two gods at her side. So Resheph is one of these two, and then there's a fertility god on the other side. So I think it's kind of an east west thing going on again. So you got the sun god with the fertility god and the kind of death god or plague god. So this role of Resheph as one of the two companions of the sun god uh, is what first clued me into a potential solar identity of Yahweh. So to expand on that, Yahweh often travels with minor deities. Usually they're called cherubs, but they go by many other names as well. So, and he doesn't just travel with them. I mean, they are sort of the drivers of the chariot, and they do his bidding in other ways too. Like I said, sending plagues or guiding the Israelites through the desert. So I found that there are almost always two of them. For example, in Genesis 19, we see that it's like the two emissaries of Yahweh are referred to, or the two malakim of Yahweh. And most people think there's just one angel of Yahweh, but I mean, in this case, we see there's at least two. So that kind of goes against that theory that there's one specific malak or angel of Yahweh. And interestingly, too, in that Genesis 19 story, there's a part where Yahweh sort of mysteriously just departs at sunset, and then he returns at sunrise. So, that kind of fits in with my theory as well. Meanwhile, the two emissaries, they remain in Sodom, the whole night. So, anyway, as for the different names of these two helper gods, so I talked about Barad and Resheph, so hail and fire. There's also, the two cherubs, um, two emissaries, Malakim. And then in Exodus, there's, of course, the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud, which I think must have some connection again to these two distinct um, divine assistants of Yahweh. And then in Habakkuk 3:5, we're told that when Yahweh rises from the mountain, he has two gods, either at his side or one in front of him, one behind him. And the two gods named are Deber and Resheph. Now, so Resheph I already talked about, but Deber is usually translated as plague, but it's also interesting that it's like a metaphysized version of Barad. So if you flip around the letters of Barad, you get this Deber. And in other passages, I found that these two gods are kind of interchangeable in terms of their role as this other god with Resheph. So I'm leaning towards them being the same god. And it's significant for my theory because, as I said, Resheph has a close relationship with the sun god, especially in those images of a triad in Egypt. But there's also the fact that the cherubs in the Bible are these like twin hybrid creatures, and they're comparable to other twin hybrid creatures that work for sun gods, such as you have the Mesopotamian Kusariku. This is bull men, like half bull, half man, that usually have wings as well, I believe, and they guard the Sumerian sun god Utu. And in Egypt, maybe more, much more. It's a much more known thing in Egypt, where you have the two Sphinx, who often appear with the sun between their shoulders, or they're holding up the divine sun boat, solar bark, just like the cherubs carry Yahweh's throne. And it's even more intriguing, I thought, that in at least one case, two minor deities that work closely with the sun god in Mesopotamia are referred to as Sarapu and Burdu. So Sarapu is the Akkadian version of the seraph, which probably means fire or burning. You find seraph in the Bible. But interestingly, it's also a metathesis, again, of Resheph. So if you rearrange the letters of Sarap, you get Resheph. So there's probably something there. And then Birdu, which is the other of the twin gods, that's just the Akkadian equivalent of that Hebrew word barad, which is usually translated hail. So I would argue that, these facts fit quite nicely with the notion that Yahweh was a sun god rather than some other type of god.